You ever wonder why trends come and go? Why the tide comes in and then goes out? Or how Keanu Reeves seems to be the only man immune to the effects of aging and the passage of time? Scientists are still hard at work answering these questions. But we're not here to talk about the latest fashion craze, though it's clear I'm an expert on that subject. What types of games and fads have stayed popular for the last 10, 20, or even 30 years? How has Pokemon and Mario managed to stay relevant? Why didn't Capcom bring back tank controls for the RE4 remake? If you've ever wondered why some trends in gaming die and others stick around, well, then get ready to rock out with your out, because today we're discussing the most metal of these trends, the rise of what would become gaming's most popular genre.
It's time to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of gum.
But with every rise comes a fall.
A king has his reign, and then he dies. It's inevitable.
It's easy to forget the humble beginnings of FPS given how massive the game industry has become, but ever since man created gun, we have enjoyed shooting things, mostly alive things. Wolfenstein 3D is credited as being the first FPS title anybody really cared about, the first Avatar, if you will. But id Software didn't invent the concept. If you think about it, first-person shooters were merely an evolution of arcade and space shooters, just a change in perspective. And battle royales are merely the evolution of arena shooters, and now extraction BRs are the hot thing, and so on and so forth. About a week ago, I told a buddy of mine I was working on a video about the rise and fall of arena shooters, and he looked at me and he was like, I don't even know what those are. And I guess that's the point. That's how far out of relevance they've fallen. But why?
Why?
Well, let's clarify. What exactly is an arena shooter? Well, typically it's a game characterized by ultra-fast movement. Things like bunny hopping, rocket jumping. You got an arsenal of weapons to choose from. Iconic things like a double-barreled shotgun or chainsaws, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, space guns, plasma rifles, all that cool shit. These games often had a weapon wheel or allowed players to hold every single weapon in the game at once. No two-weapon system to speak of. Power-ups, health, ammo, and armor are all found on the map and do not regenerate for the player when out of combat.
Bingo! As you can see, they recharge a lot faster.
Not in Quake they don't, you fucking pussy. And both teams begin the match with equal starts. These games also tend to boast the best fucking soundtracks. You could really summarize the spirit of arena shooters by listening to the classic Unreal announcer.
Monster kill! Wicked sick! Godlike! Holy shit!
While some might argue that the first true arena shooters were Quake and Unreal Tournament, it's obvious where those games got their inspiration from. Some of the most revered games of all time are arena shooters. But lately it seems nobody really cares. At least not about their multiplayer. Single player, yeah, Doom Eternal's kicked ass. But like, why does an 11-year-old game like CSGO continue to dominate Steam charts while a game fresh off the press like Quake Champions can barely scratch 4 digits? Is there no mass market appeal for these so-called boomer shooters? Well, there still is, but as we'll see later on in this video, studios didn't quite figure out how to make these games appeal to that broader audience. You might have played Doom 2016's multiplayer and thought, well, that felt antiquated. I feel like a 40-year-old man still clinging to his childhood playing this.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Perhaps you bought into the craze of Lawbreakers and later tried to hide your shame about that. Though developers have tried to revitalize the arena shooter genre, it seems none have really been successful. And since Lawbreakers, it appears
no one has dared try.
But why? Well, that's the big question of the day. Before we tackle the fall, we have to take a trip back to witness the rise. Like I said, Wolfenstein 3D put FPS on the map, and in 1993, Doom solidified its position as a legitimate contender. It's hard to grasp just how influential these two games have been. You could basically draw a line from any shooter released in the last 30 years and trace it back to Doom. So how does a genre that is that influential lose its influence and presence? Well, every masterpiece has its cheap copy, and the release of Doom spawned a rat race to emulate it. So in the early 90s, the entire FPS genre was pretty new, and it was separated into two categories. There was Doom and Doom clones, and you had to pick between one of those. Fun fact, at one point the term first-person shooter was less commonly used on internet forums than the term Doom clone. These were simpler times when news media blamed violent video games for real-world violence, and I guess they still do that. But the point is, looking at shooters today, there's such a wide variety of different experiences and subgenres, but back at this one point, there was only one viable form of this content. So Doom blew everyone's balls off in 1993, bringing with it this revolutionary new deathmatch mode. Doom also started the trend of network multiplayer and LAN parties, though primitive and only allowing up to 4 players. A year later, Doom launched its official online multiplayer component. Not to mention it offered co-op too. Sure, many of the titles I discuss are more renowned for their single player, but what gave these games staying power was the multiplayer. But before anybody could try to one-up Doom, id Software dropped their new album. Nobody could touch Doom's success, and its sequel only furthered the craze and desire to topple id Software's new godlike status. Meanwhile, Apple and Microsoft were starting to get competitive in the emerging market of PC gaming. Macintosh needed an answer to Doom.
These games are getting really realistic. Next year I might even play in the big Doom tournament.
A couple months after Doom 2, one company managed to earn a piece of the FPS pie. Sup fellas, my name's Bungie, and I feel like running a marathon. Though Marathon never became a household name, the game proved that competent alternatives to Doom could be made, and as time would pass, Bungie would be the ones to come back with a vengeance against the arena shooter that defied them. And then in 1995, George Lucas was sitting there like, you know, before I ruin the next trilogy of Star Wars films, I want to usher in the golden age of Star Wars video games. Bam! Star Wars Dark Forces comes out, the first official FPS game for Star Wars. Though it was called a Doom clone, before this, people had been making fan mods of Doom with levels based on the Death Star, and Star Wars had such a rabid, wide audience that when they heard of a computer game where you could shoot stormtroopers in first person, it drew a whole new crowd to arena shooters. But one of the most important changes Dark Forces introduced was this radical new concept to FPS. Looking up and down. We all start somewhere, right? So FPS was starting to evolve, but Dark Forces had no multiplayer, so it didn't directly threaten the other online arena shooters. It wasn't until 1996 that a new king of FPS emerged. The throne of Doom had its first true threat.
Don't have time to play with myself.
Duke Nukem 3D was the first, truly successful Doom clone, and 3D Realms succeeded with this game largely because of its change in style. Instead of this futuristic or sci-fi setting or killing demons, it was set in more modern times where you're fighting like alien pigs and stuff. It also added elements of comedy and satire to a genre that was primarily focused on murdering everything in front of you.
Bake me! Bake me!
My kind of party. Wish I had time.
Duke Nukem 3D also lampooned a lot of Hollywood action hero tropes, and with his hilarious over-the-top one-liners, the Duke became the new face of first-person shooters. More importantly, he introduced the idea that the player could be more than a mindless, silent killing machine. While everyone was splurging over the Duke and his balls of steel, id Software was down in the laboratory, cooking up their next hit. Oh, those 2D sprites are so cute. 3D realms? More like 2D bullshit. Fuck you. Check out these 3D graphics in Quake. Quake fundamentally changed online first-person shooters in more ways than one. For starters, the process of finding and joining matches was much easier and accessible. And second, this is what arena shooters looked like a year prior to Quake. So the advancements it made were just out of this world. Just like the ability to look up and down, a fully rendered 3D FPS multiplayer title was a massive revolution for the time. Quake would later spawn its own convention and popularize the art of speedrunning with the website Quake Done Quick. One could also argue that Quake was responsible for the birth of esports, as the Red Annihilation tournament drew over 2,000 participants. The winner received a fucking Ferrari from John Carmack, the co-founder of id Software. As a result of Quake's popularity in the competitive esports scene, several pro leagues started to sprout up as well. It seemed that arena shooters would only get better from here on out, and anytime id Software faced competition, they answered swiftly and decisively. So there was a lot of competition to topple what id was doing. But in 1997, something would happen that would alter the course of FPS games and lay the foundation for the fall of arena shooters. We take for granted that today a large portion of new releases are available on console and PC, but this was not the case back then. Whatever Nintendo was doing had jack shit to do with id Software's control of FPS and arena shooter market, right? Console gaming and PC gaming were two complete opposites with almost no overlap, and anytime a PC game was brought to console, it was usually a butchered version of it. So console FPS titles were never considered a legitimate threat. That is, until a certain secret agent made his debut in the 3D world of gaming. GoldenEye essentially brought FPS games to consoles, but why weren't shooters popular on console prior to GoldenEye? Well, if you could, would you really want to play this with this? Yeah, no, didn't think so. Arena shooters were simply too fast and chaotic to be played on controller, and the N64 controller was already a mutated monster to begin with. Like, GoldenEye just barely worked with this thing. Again, at this point, arena shooters were the only type of shooter. It's like you were moving fast, of course you were. But this entire stigma that FPS titles couldn't work on console changed with GoldenEye because Rareware actually stopped for a second and said, hey, does the player need to go fast? Turns out no. In fact, who would have thought slowing down movement and forcing players to make methodical decisions in combat could even be more interesting? You know, there might be something to that style of gameplay. GoldenEye didn't have an online multiplayer, so again, it didn't directly affect the popularity of Quake or other arena shooters, but couch co-op and local play became a thing, and GoldenEye planted a very important seed, one that would eventually sprout and grow to overthrow the arena shooter craze. But before that would happen, id Software saw the success of GoldenEye and was like, oh yeah, Rare, well played, but we can do that too. Yo, Midway, go make Doom 64 for the kiddies. And you know, Doom 64 didn't make waves, but it established their presence outside of the PC market, and other developers that typically catered solely to the PC crowd would try to do the same. There would be attempts to bring arena shooters to console. In 1998, Epic Games released Unreal, which sold 1.5 million copies by 2002. Arena shooters were still growing as a genre, but 1998 was a year of innovation for shooters in general, and several new subgenres started to pop up. Metal Gear Solid emphasized stealth and discouraged combat. Rainbow Six was set in a more modern, realistic setting and brought a tactical, cooperative aspect to shooting games. Star Siege Tribes, a game I never heard of prior to this, was notable for introducing massive multiplayer matches with 32v32 lobbies, something that would become the standard for Battlefield and Battlefront. Arena shooters were still the king in terms of multiplayer, but these other titles represented a growing change in taste. Gamers were starting to experience something different, and they wanted more, and Valve provided more with Half-Life. Now, Prior to Half-Life, arena shooters had competent, fun single players. Half-Life evolved in a way that few arena shooters ever would after this point. Many developers underestimated the importance of world building, storytelling, atmosphere, and cutscenes. Half-Life managed to evolve the single-player side of FPS while also putting its own spin on the arena shooter format. If games like Quake and Unreal had emphasized their single-player the way Doom did, maybe they'd still be relevant today. That's what I'm saying. Quake had taken the gaming world by storm, and with the prevalence of modding, many others were keen on taking the genre to greater heights. And what better way to try and dethrone Quake than with a mod made from it? Team Fortress Classic was an incredible turning point in the industry. Developed as a mod for Quake, Valve saw the potential in this experimental shooter and did something many didn't expect. They hired the creators of the mod to work on it as a full-fledged title. This introduced the idea of classes and heroes and preset loadouts as opposed to even starts and everything being on the map. But a hero shooter wasn't the only new kid on the block the likes of Quake and Doom had to compete with, because just 2 short months after Team Fortress Classic's release, another mod would take the world of FPS by storm, and it wouldn't let go for another 23 years. With Rainbow Six, tactical shooters were established, but Counter-Strike took the best aspects of Rainbow Six and Half-Life and threw them in a blender. Its popularity was so unprecedented, Counter-Strike was actually surpassing the games it was emulating. Especially impressive since there was no single player to speak of. Just pure, raw, multiplayer FPS goodness. Counter-Strike also revived LAN parties, and its competitive one-life team-based design created a new style of FPS esports. While the effects weren't immediate and Quake and Unreal Tournament were still wildly popular, something about Counter-Strike proved to be more interesting to the FPS gamer. Now, despite Half-Life and Counter-Strike's success, there was still very much a demand for new arena shooters, and the release of Unreal Tournament in 1999 proved this beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's a reason the Unreal Engine is named the way it is, because Unreal Tournament was such a highly modular game, and it put the same tools the developers used to make it in the hands of the player base. Cliff Bleszinski, the lead designer, attributed much of the game's success to the Unreal community. But while most shooters around this era were either set in the future or more modern times, one game series came along to take us back to the past. Medal of Honor. While today it's largely been forgotten and replaced by its younger brother Call of Duty, Medal of Honor opened the floodgates for the hordes of World War II shooters. And this began a trend of much shorter time to kills, where anybody who could point a gun could get a kill. While console shooters were on the rise, arena shooters from PC were able to find a home on these new platforms. Of course, they had to make movement and gameplay changes that were less chaotic and accessible to controller. Games like Time Splitters and Perfect Dark showed it could be done. And while GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Half-Life, Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, and Medal of Honor all introduced a new spin on this genre, arena shooters still held their ground. But the earth began to crumble, and in 2001, the fall of arena shooters was firmly set in motion. And it couldn't be stopped. The legacy and importance of Combat Evolved should be no secret to any gamer, at least of all my audience. You see, most arena shooters of the time and its emulators like Counter-Strike were still very hardcore experiences, but Halo appealed to both. It was designed as a party shooter game, something that offered the same casual 4-player fun of any Nintendo game, but in a much more mature sci-fi setting. With System Link, LAN parties for console could now emulate what online multiplayer had been doing for years. Now, some debate has been had over whether Halo is an arena shooter or not. While I think it's much more similar to this older genre of game than something like Call of Duty, anyone who's played Quake or Doom will tell you, fuck no, Halo isn't an arena shooter. Movement is much slower, you can only carry 2 weapons, not to mention melee and grenades weren't treated as their own weapons on a dial, regenerating health, etc. But Halo did share many of the same principles of arena shooters. Deathmatch equals Slayer, right? All weapons and power-ups are found on the map, and they still are. But Combat Evolved marked a big shift in the strategy of selling FPS games. They had mostly been catered to hardcore gamers on PC, but console was where the money truly was. Like Half-Life, Halo excelled in both its single-player and multiplayer offerings, spawning a multimedia franchise worth billions, with a story that captured the hearts and minds of millions of gamers. While Doom was so successful it coined the term Doom clone, Halo was much the same, spawning the phrase Halo killer. Developers were no longer trying to dethrone Doom and compete with arena shooters. They were trying to compete with Halo. At this point, arena shooters weren't on life support, but they were sweating. Had Xbox Live been ready in time for the release of Combat Evolved, it might have been game over right then and there for arena shooters. Instead, the genre saw some continued success, and franchises like Quake, Doom, and Unreal adapted to the growing console market and made their own games for these platforms, which garnered a pretty decent player base. I myself enjoyed Jedi Academy, Unreal Tournament, and Republic Commando for a time, but after this generation of console, it would be a long time before I ever played another arena shooter again. 2004 is the year that arena shooters started to fall, and the success of games like Halo 2, Call of Duty, and many others were only partially to blame. For a time, the only way to access the internet and partake in online gaming was on PC. Xbox Live made it far easier and accessible without the need for an elaborate setup. A fourth grader in the 1990s is not going to be able to figure out how to set up a PC to play Doom online, but a fourth grade kid in 2004 has a much better chance of figuring out Xbox Live. Does that make sense? Arena shooters had been growing stubborn and stagnant. It had been 11 years since Doom released, and aside from many visual upgrades, there hadn't been much that changed. Unable to settle on a direction for a sequel to Duke Nukem 3D, The Return of the King would come much too late to revive the genre, as Duke Nukem Forever would be trapped in development hell for over a decade. After its release, arena shooters might have been more dead than they were prior. Unreal Tournament had presence on Xbox Live, but wouldn't see similar levels of success on the 360, and it paled in comparison to the might of Halo 2 and Battlefront. Doom, not content with becoming irrelevant and being unable to live up to a legacy of changing video games forever, instead opted to change directions completely. With Doom 3, id Software decided to pursue a more story-driven action horror kind of game, drifting from its roots, but still receiving critical acclaim. Well, how the turntables. Instead of Half-Life copying Doom, now it's the other way around. Not to mention Counter-Strike had seen a major update with CS Source, and Call of Duty was starting its run of success as World War II shooters were becoming more mainstream. Add on to this the rise of Battlefield, Battlefront, and other massive FPS titles, and the once mighty pie that arena shooters alone used to feast on was being consumed by many others. Timesplitters, Future Perfect, Unreal Tournament, these may have been the last bastions for the genre on console. But after this, FPS titles had grown so far from their original iteration, and they weren't looking back. The release of COD 4 and Halo 3 pretty much sealed the fate of arena shooters and denied their future relevance in gaming. If you weren't willing to adapt, you weren't going to succeed. They had slower movement, regenerating health, a 2-weapon inventory. These things were antithetical to the core of arena shooters. And as developers and players started to favor the trends set by Halo 3 and COD 4, the trends set by Quake, Unreal, and Doom were quickly being forgotten. Modern military and World War II shooters had firmly taken over. After this generation of consoles, new arena shooters were few and far between, and those that did release, well, I can't really think of any on the Xbox 360. I guess that's the point, huh? FPS titles were now more about personal accomplishment, easily shared user-generated content, progression systems, social features, all things that most arena shooters failed to adapt to. And cooperative shooters like Left 4 Dead, Destiny, and Borderlands started cropping up, and now FPS had such a mainstream appeal. Call of Duty and Halo were much more new user-friendly. It changed the demographic substantially, as filthy casuals like myself now found ourselves screeching into the void on Xbox Live. And if me as a 7th grader could play Halo 3 on my console, why would I hop to PC to play an arena shooter? FPS titles were a lot more social and team-oriented now. Halo had vehicles, Call of Duty had trash talk in lobbies, it had zombies, Battlefield had squads, Counter-Strike had teamwork and coordination, and arena shooters were Still just zipping and zooming around without a care in the world. You guys want to go fast again? Are we still popular? I hope so. Some of you Call of Duty veterans may remember a playlist in COD 4 called Old School. Most of you will have no idea what I'm talking about because less than 2 years after release, the playlist was one of the least populated and consistently sat under 1,000 players. Old School mode was the arena shooter version of COD 4. But while Infinity Ward tried to pay homage, it was clear they were paying homage to a relic of the past. And this mode was abandoned in all future releases outside of COD 4 Remastered. So this begs the question, why didn't arena shooters stay relevant? It's not like just because there were other offerings that it made arena shooters objectively worse, right? So what happened? Horrible new player experience. Almost no one wants to fight FPS players with thousands of hours while they haven't played 5 hours yet. You can barely strafe without losing track of enemies while you get people rocket jumping and murdering you before you can even react.
If you can point and shoot, you can play Insurgency. If you've played Rising Storm for an hour, you can kill someone who's played for 1,000. Arena shooters, however, not only is there more complexity in moment-to-moment gameplay, but there's also a lot more punishment for failure. In Rising Storm, one death is a drop in the bucket, and loadouts keep your character consistently powerful. But in Quake, that death not only grants the enemy a point, it also means they're given the upper hand next time. You become a mouse who must slay the cat. Lower player counts in these games result in frequent occasions of less experienced players being pummeled with no room to grow, which itself creates a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If you think about even the most hardcore fighting games, a casual can pick up a controller, mash buttons, and sometimes win. The skill gap in arena shooters is just too polarizing for casual players to enjoy without becoming a hardcore player themselves. There's also far too many different subgenres of shooter to compete with nowadays that what worked in the 90s is looked at as antiquated. There's a stigma around it. Gamers want something more than bunny hopping around a static landscape for 10 minutes. They want to progress. They want a ranking system, things to unlock, a class to build, armor to customize. Hell, it wasn't even just the rise of other shooter genres. The rise of online gaming as a whole served to thwart the arena shooter monopoly. But at the same time, you might be thinking, well, Actman, companies like id Software and Valve were still doing really well. Why couldn't they revive arena shooters? Well, id Software and Valve sat in similar positions after the success of Doom 3 and Half-Life 2. They had too much dignity to milk their franchises and create anything less than a stellar, revolutionary new entry. And so both franchises went dormant for years. Epic Games was developing a new arena shooter back in 2014, but completely switched focus to work on this upcoming third-person shooter. How long would Epic Games have been in business if they hadn't abandoned Unreal Tournament for Fortnite? Duke Nukem Forever, like I said, had no fucking direction whatsoever. That was just a pure disaster. And Quake 3 was a big hit, but it took like 9 years for a sequel to come out. And by that point, Halo 2 and Xbox Live were blasting off into space. And the next Half-Life game would be a VR title released 500 million years after Half-Life 2. But what about Doom 2016? That had an arena shooter multiplayer, and you're right, it was okay, but it also like really sucked ass. Like playing as demons in multiplayer and killing other players, that's what was cool about Doom 2016's multiplayer, and almost everything else kind of sucked ass. Especially all these unforgivable dances. The multiplayer of Doom 2016 felt like it was checking a box, as 98% of the effort went towards the single player. So all the franchises and studios that had pioneered arena shooters were either fucking up or doing something completely different. Bethesda and id Software did revive Doom, but as an experience of being an ultra badass blasting demons. And with its sequel Eternal, they ditched the entire concept of arena multiplayer entirely in favor of making this one mode that I played 3 times and never touched again. So if Doom couldn't revitalize the arena shooter genre, who could? Nobody. Certainly not fucking lawbreakers. If you check the player count of the arena shooter genre on Steam, it's barely a fraction of what CSGO pulls in, and player count alone doesn't matter. You can still play these games and they are still very much alive, but they're not nearly as important or relevant. Splitgate might be the best example of a comeback, but that comeback was short-lived and its player base has evaporated since. Though the studio is working on a sequel, the reason Splitgate even saw this level of success as a pure arena shooter was due to its incredible portal gimmick, and movement and aiming was much more accessible to newcomers. This was adapting to trends. It seems the best way of bringing back arena shooters was through fun, easy to understand movement tech like grappling hooks. And what do you know? This feature has been universally praised and beloved in Doom Eternal, Halo Infinite, and Titanfall 2. Arena shooters simply didn't adapt in a way that could attract a new audience, so they were left with their dwindling old boomers. They were too stubborn, adhering to the things that made them popular, like rocket jumping, and newcomers didn't feel compelled to master all the nuances of these games and their movement just to get 2 kills. This is why we saw trends of offering rewards to bad players, with things like death streaks in Modern Warfare 2, ordnance drops in Halo 4, Titans in Titanfall. Everybody gets a Titan no matter how poorly you do. Developers realized that the casual audience shouldn't be neglected. They introduced a lot of elements of randomness. Anyone can grab the Thanos glove in Fortnite and become a badass. Anyone can hit the Smash Ball in Smash Bros. And unleash a devastating attack. Not to mention, if people were going to master a video game, they'd rather master aspects like positioning, aim, strategy, what weapons I go for. These aspects you see in games like Rainbow Six and Counter-Strike. The reason Call of Duty has never given up its extremely short time to kill is because that's what attracts the casual audience. This is one of the fundamental differences between modern shooters that are successful and why arena shooters have fallen out of favor. So what happened to arena shooters? Gatekeeping happened. Quakers want you to follow jank written guides on how to perform basic movement because things like bunny hopping and rocket jumping aren't explained in the games, and never had intuitive control systems implemented that made those actions easier. Shooting at a blur darting across a CRT monitor with a ball mouse while compensating for 200 millisecond lag isn't very engaging for hours either. And by the time technology caught up with the genre, taste in multiplayer had long changed. In short, the movement of games like Quake are what made arena shooters great, but it's also what made it impossible to grow because it was inaccessible to newcomers. By the time the Xbox One and PS4 generations launched, arena shooters had all but fallen out of memory, and any new attempts at reviving the genre hardly made a splash. The games felt outdated, primitive. Even when you look at Doom 2016, it looks like it's from the early 2000s. And each new release that failed to garner a significant audience only made it harder for the next one to try. And at a certain point, they just stopped trying. I hope you have enjoyed this trip back into history, examining the intricacies of the FPS genre and arena shooters. And I am kind of sad that they've fallen out of favor. There have been some indie games that perform moderately well, and a lot of these arena shooters are still playable with very small but dedicated player bases. Like, you could still play the original Half-Life's multiplayer if you really want to. It's actually quite fun. But it's clear that interest in this genre has never been lower, and even Quake Champions seems unable to break into the mainstream. Still, we owe a lot to these ancient classics, but their reign as king has ended. So I hope you've come to understand how and why this genre died out. It wasn't instant, but slow. It's a case of stubborn pride and a change in trends. Still, when I listen to the metal as fuck soundtrack of Quake 2, I feel this urge to go fast and jump around. I feel like maybe there's hope, but to be honest, I'm not sure if there's an arena shooter that could interest me at this point. Whatever chance there might have been for arena shooters to make a comeback and return, it most likely died with Doom Eternal. But if anyone can bring back the intense, fast-paced action of arena shooters and revive the genre, it's gonna be Doom. And that has been the rise and fall of arena shooters. So thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to the Act Man for more awesome content. What do you think of this genre of game? Have you played any arena shooters recently, or thinking about revisiting one? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Big shout out to all my patrons. Thank you for continuing to support the channel. I love each and every one of you. If you'd like to support me, you can do so. All right, everyone, that's all I got for today. This is the Act Man signing out. Peace.